Well, good evening and welcome to the Smoky Mountain Field School's new webinar series that highlights the various research activities in Great Smoky Mountains National Park. Tonight's program is our second monthly webinar of 2021, and we're certainly delighted with the early response to this new programming. The Smoky Mountain Field School is a 44-year partnership between Great Smoky Mountains National Park and the University of Tennessee, Knoxville. My name is Darren DeVault. I serve as the director of UT non-credit programs, which is the host department for the Smoky Mountain Field School. I will be your moderator for tonight. In addition to the complimentary monthly webinars, the Field School offers weekend hikes, cultural history programs, and many other expert-led adventures in Great Smoky Mountains National Park, both on the Tennessee side and the North Carolina side. We have 5 courses scheduled for April, so please visit utnon-credit.com for complete course descriptions and to register. For tonight's webinar, we are delighted to feature the research of Jessica Braunstein, a graduate research assistant in UT's Department of Forestry, Wildlife, and Fisheries. Jessica will talk about recent and ongoing research conducted by the University of Tennessee and its research partners on black bears and elk. Following her presentation, we'll open the Zoom room for a brief question and answer period. At that time, you can drop your questions in the chat box or ask your question live of Jessica. Jessica, if you're ready, it's your turn.
All right, sounds good. Well, thanks, Darren, and thank you all for being here. It's always exciting to talk a little bit about the research that we've been doing. Yeah, so like Darren said, I am a PhD student at the University of Tennessee, and I've been fortunate enough to be involved in a couple of different bear and elk studies in the Smokies, and that's what I'll be talking about today. So to start things off, I'll be talking a little bit about some black bear research that I helped conduct from 2015 to 2018. That was actually part of my master's work at the time. And I think it's important just to start with a little bit of background about the park for maybe those of you all that aren't very familiar with it. So Great Smoky Mountains National Park is the most visited national park in the country. I believe last year they topped over 12 million visitors. And there's also quite a bit of tourism in the surrounding communities. So you can see in that figure at the bottom, that gray outline is the park boundary, and all of those black pins are different cities and communities that surround the park. The park's also home to an estimated 1,900 American black bears. So as you can imagine, when you have that many visitors coming into the park and you also have a very high bear density, we get a lot of human-bear interactions. Now that's not always a bad thing, but it can be, especially if these bears are repeatedly exposed to very close human contact, and if they receive quite a few, we call them food rewards. So they go out and maybe get into trash, or get into someone's cooler, things like that. And those bears, they start to develop what we call conflict behaviors. And so we refer to those animals as conflict animals. Now, the National Park Service uses a very proactive strategy to try to prevent bears from becoming conflict animals. So if you've spent any time in the Smokies, I'm sure you've seen all the signs throughout the park that remind visitors to store their trash and their food properly. But there's also a lot of bear-resistant trash cans throughout the park, and then they also use what's called on-site capture and release for some bears. So basically what that is they get individuals that maybe their conflict behavior isn't crazy advanced just yet, and they'll actually catch that bear, chemically immobilize it, and then do body measurements, things like that, give it ear tags, and then they let it go. And a lot of times, if you catch a bear before that behavior's become very established, you can prevent it from happening again in the future. And all of these strategies have actually worked out pretty well for the park in the past. However, in the few years leading up to my particular study, they started observing bears with pretty advanced conflict behavior showing up in the national park. So when I say advanced conflict behavior, think of the photo on the left with the bear in Chimney's picnic area during the middle of the day with no fear of people raiding a picnic area. So that led to some questions about whether, are there holes in the park management strategy that are resulting in bears becoming conflict animals that need to be addressed, or there was some speculation that maybe bears are actually going into the communities that we talked about that surround the park. They get into trash, things like that, and develop conflict behavior there, and then bring that into the Smokies. And that's really where the particular project I worked on came in. We were trying to address some of those questions. And so the way we did that was we actually used GPS technology on radio collars. We deployed about 50 of those on bears in the Smokies to get an idea of where they were moving, how much time they were spending on private land versus public land to the park, and trying to get a grasp of how important those communities were in the development of conflict behavior. So we use a combination of free range darting. So this is one of the park biologists out free range darting a bear in Gatlinburg, culvert trapping, and then foot snaring to actually catch bears to put collars on them. Now the foot snaring part we only really used in the backcountry areas, and really the goal of that was to catch bears that we thought would display more wild behavior, so bears that maybe hadn't become conflict animals quite yet to use as a control group. Now, all the bears were fitted with GPS collars. These collars are about $3,600 a piece, so they're pretty expensive. And each of those collars was programmed to collect a location every 2 hours. And then when those bears actually moved into towns, the location would actually jump up to every 20 minutes. And that was so we could get a finer look at what bears were doing when they went to towns and things like that. So here's an example of what some of that GPS data looked like. You can see each of those yellow dots is actually a GPS fix from a particular collar that we had out. So this specific animal was a female bear that we had actually caught kind of on the park boundary near Gatlinburg. And what was interesting about her was that, as you can see, there's quite a bit of developed area in that satellite imagery. That's actually downtown Gatlinburg. So this particular female bear pretty much every night would go into Gatlinburg, and then during the day would come back into the park, and then the next night go back into Gatlinburg. So it was really interesting to see that. It can be kind of challenging to summarize our results in such a short amount of time for this presentation, but I'm just going to hit a couple highlights and things I thought were pretty interesting. So in this map here, you can actually see all of our GPS points that we collected over the course of the study. So we collected over 300,000 locations, over 50 bears were collared, and each of the bears is represented in this map by a different color. Now, during this study, 93% of our male study bears actually had home ranges that included areas outside the park boundary, and then 57% of our female bears also had home ranges outside park boundaries. So when I say home range, I'm referring to the area that a bear uses on a regular basis for foraging, finding mates, and things like that. And the reason this matters is because bears were likely to encounter trash and human food sources that could lead to food conditioning and the development of conflict behavior when they go into these areas where there are less regulations and things like that on trash containment. Another finding that I thought was interesting was just how far some of these bears travel on a regular basis, particularly our male bears. So prior to the study, I don't think many of us realized just how common it was for a bear to travel from different ends of the park. So in this particular figure, you can see 3 different male bears represented by different colors. All 3 of them spent time in and around Gatlinburg in particular. So Gatlinburg is kind of on that north boundary of the park in the center of the map. But they also spent large amounts of time on the far south or east ends of the park. We also noticed that some of the males would spend a large amount of time, say around Fontana, on the south side of the park, then travel all the way to Gatlinburg for a bit, be there for a tiny bit of time, and then travel back to Fontana. And the thing is, we don't typically think of a bear causing problems in Gatlinburg being the same conflict bear that shows up in Maggie Valley, North Carolina a week later. But this data shows that that is definitely possible. Now, another thing, while I was researching some of the regulations related to bears and areas surrounding the park, I was surprised to learn that the city of Gatlinburg is actually the only community with any sort of legal mandate requiring the use of bear-resistant trash containers, or like bear-proof um, dumpsters and things like that. So in this figure, you can see the city of Gatlinburg in pink. And now on this figure, the city of Gatlinburg is actually in that black outline now. So while the city has these regulations, they actually only apply to a very small area that butts up against the national park, which is called the ordinance zone. So you can see the ordinance zone here in kind of that gray hatching. And if you're wondering what all those purple dots are on the map, those are actually GPS locations of bears that we picked up over the course of the study. And so what you're seeing is that bears actually travel into the ordinance zone on a pretty frequent basis, but they also travel well beyond it. In fact, the ordinance zone is actually pretty small. It's not even 1/10 the size of a male bear's home range. So as you can imagine, if a male bear's home range ends up overlapping this area, the bear is still likely to encounter food and garbage elsewhere in its regular travels. We saw in some of those previous slides how far some of the males will travel. So in a perfect world, if a bear didn't get food or garbage in the ordinance zone in Gatlinburg, it's still likely to encounter those things in the neighboring communities that passes through. So one of the things that came out of this research was just the thought that maybe it's time to actually revisit the ordinance zone, potentially expand it, or also think more on a regional scale. So do we need to try to contact communities all along the northern boundary of the park and get them on board? And that might actually help with some of these conflict issues that we're seeing, especially on that interface of private and public land. Now, these couple slides are just for, in case you're interested in becoming more involved or learning more, there is a Smoky Mountains Bearwise Community Task Force, and they're actually trying to tackle some of these issues with ordinance zones and things like that. So you can do a quick Google search of them and find quite a bit of information. And I'd also recommend checking out www.bearwise.org. That's a really great website to learn more about how you as a resident or a tourist coming into the area can act and behave responsibly in bear country. So now I'm going to completely shift gears and talk about some elk research. And this project is ongoing. It started in 2019. We hope to wrap up by 2023. And this is actually part of my PhD work. So again, just a little bit of background. So prior to European settlement, elk were actually abundant throughout North America. However, once settlers arrived, most of the elk populations throughout the eastern United States were wiped out. You can see in this figure here, the green actually shows the historic elk range, and then red is the current elk range. You can see it's definitely been reduced quite a bit. The population I'm studying and I'll be talking about is actually that little red dot on the Tennessee and North Carolina border. So in the 90s, Rocky Mountain Elk Foundation and the National Park Service started talking about the potential of bringing elk back into North Carolina, and specifically into the Cataloochee Valley of Great Smoky Mountains National Park. So in that map, that blue rectangle is the Cataloochee Valley. They did a little bit of research to see if maybe the habitat could actually support an elk herd. And they decided that it could. And so from 2001 to 2002, a total of 52 elk were actually translocated from other areas into the valley. Now, following the translocation efforts, there's actually quite a bit of research done. There's a lot of interest in whether the population was becoming established or if it was growing or declining. And Jennifer Murrow, who was actually a PhD student at UT as well, she actually looked at population demographics pretty early on. And one of the interesting findings that she found was that the population was actually declining slightly. So it was declining by 0.4% each year. And she determined that the best way to tackle this and try to get the population to increase was actually to look at calf survival. So one of the interesting things that they had observed over the course of those years that she was researching was that black bears were actually killing the elk calves early on. So these female elk, we call them cows, give birth in the spring and early summer. And so they're out on these edges of these fields, and they'd leave their calves. These calves are so young, they're immobile still. And the cows would go forage. And during that time, those bears would actually come in and eat the calves. And the cows came from populations when they were brought in from areas where black bears weren't really an issue. So a lot of them were just naive to how to handle that sort of pressure. So Joe Yarkovich, who's actually a wildlife biologist in the national park now, he actually spent his master's relocating bears from the Cataloochee Valley during calving season, moving them to other parts of the park. And that gave those calves just enough time to get their legs underneath them that they could actually escape bears and things like that. So they actually did that for 3 years. They would relocate these bears, and they saw that it really did increase the calf recruitment. So calf survival into the following year. So they actually only did that for about 3 years. After that, it seemed like the cows kind of figured out how to deal with the bears. And they did some additional population work in the years following that, and they found that the population was actually growing at that point. So we were seeing a 7.4% annual increase. So where we're at now is it's been about 20 years since the original translocation efforts. And the elk population's definitely grown from those initial 52 individuals. And it's also expanded beyond the Smokies boundaries. So on that map, you can see again, the Cataloochee Valley is that blue rectangle, but you can also see the current elk range in the state is shown by red. So they've spread out quite a bit. And because of that, elk are now managed by multiple agencies. So the National Park Service manages elk within park boundaries. North Carolina Wildlife Resource Commission manages elk that's on private land or outside park boundaries. And then the Eastern Band of Cherokee Indians actually manages any elk on tribal land over near Cherokee. And one of the things that the state does, all these different agencies collaborate in the fall to do what are called minimum counts. And this is how they actually get their population estimate. So if you go to the State Wildlife Agency's website right now, it states there's roughly 200 elk. And they estimate that based on minimum counts. The minimum counts are literally where you go out to these fields where elk tend to hang out in the early mornings and evenings. And agency personnel will literally just count the number of elk they see. And they'll do this over 2 consecutive days in the fall, and that gives them an idea of what the minimum number of elk there are in the area. Now, obviously, there are some limitations to this approach. You're definitely going to miss some elk. Some of them are going to be in the woods. They're not going to be visible. An entire herd may not come out in the fields the day you happen to be out sampling or going out to observe them. So this approach isn't the most scientifically or statistically rigorous. And that's really where my particular project came in. So the State Wildlife Agency has expressed interest in getting an updated and statistically rigorous population estimate. And this is really important because going forward, as the elk population seems to continue to be growing, they need these numbers to make sound management decisions going forward. So one thing the state is actually interested in is potentially having a hunting season in the future. And obviously they want some very sound scientific data before they make a decision like that. So the approach that we propose using that isn't minimum counts is using a series of transects. So we go out, we walk these transects, and we actually collect elk scat, and we take fecal DNA from those samples to identify individuals in the population. And the great thing about that method is it's non-invasive, so we don't actually need to catch the animals, which could put them at risk. So real quick, what does a transect look like? We literally go out and we walk these straight lines. Our search lengths are anywhere from 500 meters to 1,500 meters. And we're searching in a width of 2 meters, so basically my arm span. And while we're doing that, we're looking at the ground and we're collecting any elk scats that we find along the way. And obviously there are going to be some on the landscape that we miss, but that's okay. The sampling approach will incorporate all the spatial data as well as the fecal DNA, so the genetic data, into these models to get an idea of how many elk there are out there. So this is just a quick depiction of what our 2020 field sampling season looked like. So the elk range is shown there in kind of that yellowish polygon. And each of those purple lines is a transect. So every winter we go out and walk 410 transects and look for elk scat all across the elk range. In case you didn't know what elk scat looks like, here it is. Now the DNA is actually on the outer surfaces of those pellets. So it's really important that that DNA isn't degraded. And the reason we sample in the winter is because there's less likely to be issues with precipitation, which will actually wash the DNA off the outer surfaces of those pellets. And there's slightly less issues with UV rays, which will also degrade DNA. So we're using a multi-year sampling approach. So our first winter field season was in 2020. We literally just finished up our second field season this week, and we'll be doing an additional field season next winter from January to March. And basically every year we're able to get a population abundance estimate, so N. And the great thing by sampling over multiple years is that we can look at how the population has changed over time. So we can get an idea of, is the population growing? Is it declining? And then we can also answer some questions about survival and recruitment. So, how many individuals don't make it to the next year, or how many new individuals are added each year? So how many calves are born and things like that. So that's really all I have. I know that was a really quick summary. I wanted to fit this in the 20-minute time frame. But I want to say thank you first to Darren with the Smoky Mountain Field School for hosting us and having me. And then, of course, these projects wouldn't be possible without a lot of different collaborators and funding sources, which I have listed here. So yeah, now at this point, that's all I have. So I'm happy to take any questions. Darren, I don't know if you want me to turn it over to you first.
Well, I'll lead off the questions. My question is, what's the most unexpected thing that you've learned about elk from your research?
Most unexpected thing about elk. This is going to sound very odd, but there are all sorts of shapes and sizes of scat out there. It's been really interesting to see. We've seen a lot of scat over the course of this study, but also just some of the places that they've traveled, some of the areas that we've sampled, we kind of assumed we weren't likely to see elk, but then we would find, like an old sample on the ground, which indicates that an elk has been there at some point, even if it was just passing through. So that's been really interesting to see just how far that they've actually traveled around the state.
Okay, well, I'm going to open the floor for anyone that has a question for Jessica. We have about 7 or 8 minutes, so we've got time to squeeze in several questions. If you don't feel comfortable asking it live, you can drop it in the chat box and I'll ask it of Jessica.
I have a question, Jessica.
Yeah.
My brother lives in Franklin, North Carolina, and he says he's seen an elk over there. I guess it wandered that far.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so we're actually not really sampling that far, but I have heard multiple people state that they have seen elk over there, and I believe there's at least one with a GPS collar that hangs out in that area. I don't know that they have a herd that's established there necessarily, but it sounds like there have been at least 1 or 2 passing through.
And have any made it to Cades Cove yet?
Not to Cades Cove yet. There were 2, I would think it was 2 males that made it over to the Tennessee side over near Chimney's picnic area a couple years ago. And then they ended up at the Sugarlands Visitor Center at the headquarters lawn. I think they've had one that was hanging out in Townsend for a bit, but not quite to Cades Cove just yet.
Thank you.
Next question. I don't see any questions in the chat box, Jessica. Any kind of closing remarks that you might have for our audience tonight?
I guess one thing I failed to mention was, we're going to do one more winter field season in 2022, and then we hope to have some sort of final report by the middle of 2023 that'll actually give a pretty solid estimate of how many elk there are out there. I think that figure that the state puts out there, roughly 200 is pretty close, but we'll hopefully have something that's a little bit more, I guess, statistically sound by the end of this.
Gotcha. Well, if we have no more questions, we'll let you go. So many thanks to go out to Jessica Braunstein for sharing her really interesting and fascinating research on black bear and the elk and the Smokies. And thanks to all the Smoky Mountain enthusiasts who've joined us tonight for our second monthly webinar. Our next webinar for the Smoky Mountain Field School is scheduled for noon on Thursday, April 29th. Emma Wilcox, who is an associate professor in UT's Department of Forestry, Wildlife, and Fisheries, will make a presentation about her research and work with bats, spotted skunks, and wood rats. So we hope you'll join us next month. Thanks, everyone.